A few days ago we got some extremely worrying news. In October 2021, inflation in the US reached a record high of 6.2%. This is a figure so high that we have not seen it since 1990, that is more than 30 years ago. This inflation figure explains that consumer prices have risen an overall 6.2%. This means that everything we consume every day is 6.2% more expensive in October of this year compared to October 2020. This is a real nightmare for the economy. Inflation is an economic plague that eats away at all your savings because you can buy less things and your cost of living goes up when there is inflation. To give some examples, house prices have risen 20% on average in the US this year. Food prices are up 30% this year. Rents are up 16.4% on average this year. And the worst part of all this is that wages have not been going up. In recent years, wages in the US have been stagnant without much growth. So, the situation is very worrying. Prices of absolutely everything are skyrocketing thanks to inflation, while we are not earning more. This is something that US President Joe Biden is very concerned about. Joe Biden currently has one of the lowest levels of support of recent US presidents, only 42.8% of Americans support him. So the crisis facing Joe Biden with inflation may end up digging his political grave. Therefore, Joe Biden just said that lowering inflation is one of his highest priorities. But where is all this inflation coming from, and what can Joe Biden do to bring inflation levels down? That is, what is his plan? In this video I will explain what is the real cause of the inflation we are seeing. I'm also going to explain how Joe Biden plans to lower inflation. I would like to ask you to watch to the end of the video and tell me if this plan is really a good idea. So, let's start by understanding what causes this inflation. As everything in the economy, the prices of things are determined by supply and demand. Therefore, inflation, rising prices, is usually caused by changes in supply and demand. The demand for goods and services in an economy usually depends on how much money people have. If a country's citizens have more money, it usually means that there will be more demand for products and services, as citizens can spend more. And in the case of the US, even though there was an economic crisis during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve stimulated the economy by printing almost 50% more dollars than there were in existence. Because of this, Americans have received a lot of support and have also been able to save money because they were locked up at home without spending. That's right, savings levels in the US have reached an all-time high thanks to the pandemic. So, now that people are getting back to normal, demand for products and services has skyrocketed. People are going to restaurants, they're going to movies, they're traveling and they're going to concerts. But a rise in demand only explains part of the equation, the other part is explained by supply. As it turns out, the supply of products and services in the US has not been rising at the rate of demand. First, as you may know from my videos, we are experiencing a shortage of microchips, which is causing companies that produce appliances, automobiles and other technologies to be unable to produce these products at the rate of demand. Without having microchips, these producers cannot produce what is required of them. We are also experiencing a crisis in global shipping. Hundreds of cargo ships full of products are idling outside the world's largest ports, driving up the prices of those products. On the other hand, we are also experiencing a labor crisis in the US, where companies are desperate for workers. If so, there are too many jobs available and not enough workers willing to take them. So, not having enough workers and having to raise those wages to attract those workers, companies are seeing less production. Another point contributing to rising prices is the rising price of natural resources such as oil. As you will see in this graph, the price of oil has recovered and is at higher levels than before the pandemic. In order to produce things we need natural resources, and if they are expensive, products will also be expensive. Finally, although industrial production in the US has been recovering, it is still lower than before the pandemic. So, all these factors explain why the supply of goods and services has been low in the US. This is where we have to take a step back. Then inflation rises thanks to changes in supply and demand. Demand has risen to record levels thanks to money printing and economic stimulus. But, the supply of goods and services in the US has not been rising at the same pace, thanks to low industrial production, microchip shortages, disruption in shipping, the labor crisis and rising natural resource prices. So, all of these factors contributed to the prices of all the things we consume going up 6.2% in October 2021. The most worrisome part of this is that the trend is that inflation is likely to continue to rise as we enter Christmas, the most important time in terms of consumption and the time where demand for products and services skyrockets. And this brings us back to US President Joe Biden. Joe Biden before inflation was looking at a serious problem, only 42.8% of citizens support him. That is a very low number, and as you will see it is going lower and lower and lower. And now that inflation is rising and wages are stagnant, the population is furious. Historically, if inflation in any country goes up, the first people they look at are the politicians. And as former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers said, if Joe Biden doesn't bring inflation down, Trump will be back. In response, Joe Biden is addressing the people by saying that inflation is now one of the most important issues of his presidency. And that brings us to Joe Biden's plan to combat inflation, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this plan is almost non-existent. First, the president doesn't have much power over inflation, since in theory the US should be a free market economy. The moment Joe Biden starts saying he can bring inflation down, he is going to have to meddle in the economy. Second, Joe Biden says he is going to fight inflation by lowering the prices of things. But, unfortunately, the prices of all things are going up thanks to excessive demand because of money printing, and also because of the production problems I already mentioned to you. Nevertheless, Joe Biden says he has met and will continue to meet with the heads of all the big companies like Walmart, Target, Costco and IKEA to make sure they don't raise their prices. IKEA, for example, is already trying its best not to raise its prices and make the situation worse. But, unfortunately, it seems that this is not going to last long as IKEA warns that they are going to raise their prices. Another thing Joe Biden plans to do is to fight the pandemic so that there are no lock-ins. Confinements are terrible for the economy, so these have to be avoided at all costs, but unfortunately this is not up to him. The only thing he can do is to ask the population to protect themselves and immunize themselves. Another thing Joe Biden has tried to do is to talk to other oil-producing countries to lower their prices. And unfortunately they don't listen to him because they don't care if inflation goes up in the US. The more oil prices go up, the more they benefit. And finally, another thing that Joe Biden has said he is going to do is to solve the logistics problems and the container crisis at the seaports. This is a very good initiative, but again the government has very little power over this as the ports and container ships are run by private companies. So in simple words, what Joe Biden has done so far to be able to curb inflation has not helped. But there are two things that Joe Biden can do to actually bring inflation down. The first thing he can do is lift the tariffs that former President Trump imposed on Chinese goods. Almost everything we consume comes from China, and Trump decided to impose tariffs on all Chinese products. Removing those tariffs could make products a little cheaper and would be a relief to stores that are trying their best not to raise prices. Joe Biden could also change the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. The Federal Reserve has printed $1 new for every 2 in circulation and has lowered interest rates on bank loans to 0%. This makes money cheap and plentiful, and to this day money is still being printed every month and interest is still at 0%. Biden has the power to choose a new head of the Federal Reserve, someone who will stop stimulating the economy. But he is not going to do this, because if he elects a new head of the Federal Reserve who stops printing money and raises interest rates, it could cause a whole collapse in the world economy. I am serious, all companies, governments and individuals are in debt at levels never seen before. If we stop stimulating the economy and raise interest rates on debts, this will burst. It would be the mother of all bubbles that will leave the economy in ruins. This is something he knows and understands he is not going to do. But there is also a dilemma here. Joe Biden and the Democrats want to pass a new stimulus, the biggest stimulus ever in the history of the US. This is going to be a reform that is going to cost several $1 trillion. It is to rebuild the infrastructure and the education system of the US. This is where the dilemma lies. The US is over $29 trillion in debt and is going to have to borrow even more money to pay for all of this. All this money will have to be printed by the Federal Reserve. So, by passing this new stimulus, inflation will probably go even higher. Because there is going to be more money in circulation, and this is something that the opposition has mentioned to Joe Biden. He responds that these reforms in infrastructure and education are going to cause benefits in the long run, and they're going to cause energy prices to go down because there's going to be investment in renewable energy. So Joe Biden has a dilemma. Inflation is threatening to take away his presidency, and he wants to pass this historic stimulus that will probably make inflation worse. That leads me to ask you, what do you think about the current situation in the US? Do you think inflation is going to keep going up? And do you think Joe Biden is going to end up losing power because of this? I look forward to your comments below.